So thank you, Rick. Let me preface this session by saying there's no pressure when you're up here on the stage in front of all your friends and your colleagues and those that work in the profession. You will notice first and foremost, for those of you who are astute readers in what is on the screen before you and in the app in front of you, that there is just me on this stage. Unfortunately, my friend and colleague, Emily LaGrada, who leads her own consulting group, LaGrada Consulting, is in the New York City area. And for those of you who have been following the news and the weather, there has been some challenges in the New York area due to some weather-related events. And unfortunately, her flights were canceled and then canceled again, and she was unable to make it here. So, like the good court administrators that we are, in the topic about what did we learn during a pandemic, a thing we also did not predict was going to happen, we have to pivot on the spot. So thanks to my friends and colleagues here at NACM and the folks at the National Center for State Courts who lent a helping hand and will do so at the end of this presentation. We had to make a couple of minor course corrections here. So you'll have to bear with me as I had to go through all of Emily's content as well as my own and kind of reorganize things just a little bit more. So let me start this off and say that the last couple years, as you well know, has been a challenge to all of us, right? We have done things probably that we never expected to do in the court system. We moved in a lot of places to almost entirely an in-person proceedings and goings on to largely virtual for an extended period of time. All during this process, while never, in most cases, ever shutting the doors of our courthouses. Despite our colleagues in the executive branch and legislature and businesses that shuttered their doors for weeks or months at a time, we remained open. So I want you all, as we embrace this conversation about what did we learn from the pandemic, to just take a moment and look at your colleagues in the room and kind of give each other that subtle, yeah, that nod of just give a little bit of appreciation, a little air hug, whatever it is, about all the hard work that we've done in the last couple years. So as we think about that, and as we transition from this world where we're no longer under a public health emergency, but yet the pandemic and COVID and some of the conditions still remain, we still have some economic challenges in some areas. We've got some issues and backlogs and case demands, and all the challenges that were there prior to the pandemic still exist, and in some cases are still being exacerbated around us. So as we transitioned into this world of what next, we have to take a moment and say, what have we learned? What has happened in the last 3 years that we want to take note of, that we actually learned a good lesson from, and that we want to hold on to? Now, I can assure you there are plenty of you probably in this room and your colleagues back home and some of your judges who want to go back to the old way of doing things. I would argue that the old way is just not the way. There is a new way that we have to move forward, learning from some of the lessons that have come from the pandemic here. So as we transition to this, I want you all to take a moment, first and foremost, before we get into any of the content, go into the app that everybody should have on their nice little smartphones in front of them. Go into this session, and on there's going to be a little chat, and then right under that is going to be polling. There are 2 questions I want you to just take a quick gut check moment in time here and ask yourselves this first question. Have our courts improved upon justice for all in the past 3 years? In whatever definition or understanding that you may have of justice for all. So it's pretty simple, a yes, a no, or a, I'm not really sure. I could say it's sort of like the eye doctor, is it better, worse, or about the same? But we're just gonna cut to the chase and say yes, no, or you're not really sure. So the second question that we want you to take a look at is thinking about post-pandemic practices. So now where we are now, that we are exiting the pandemic, or at least exiting the public health emergency portion of the pandemic, what is the one thing that your court needs, other than funding, because if I didn't put funding in there, everybody would list that, in order for whatever practices that you've put in place to be successful? So we gave you a couple of choices to choose from. Choose the one that you think is the most important. So we want you, if you need a moment, do that over the next couple of minutes as I go through this next piece. When we come back together, we'll get the results of those and share those back with you all. So take a moment, just do that reality check. So where are we right now? As we take a look back at the last 3 years of the pandemic, again, we made a lot of challenges. We met them head on. You all worked very hard. You all did things that you probably were not expecting yourselves to do. How many of you here cleaned on a regular basis? Right? How many of you handed out masks and hand sanitizer and disinfectant cleaner and tried to find that stuff when it could not be found because everybody else needed it as well? And gosh knows it needed to go to the healthcare practitioners first, but we were also staying open during that whole time. So we did things that we never expected we would do. I would also venture to say that most of us went to some form of virtual hearings or hybrid hearings or some combination of those over time. How many of you were doing a lot of hand-holding with either your colleagues or your judges on, this is Zoom, it's a verb, but it's also a thing. And Zoom is a thing that you use to communicate. So we added a new lexicon into our vocabulary about Zooming or WebExing or Teamsing or all kinds of new phrases that we developed. I can remember in the early days of the pandemic having many a conversation at my kitchen counter when I was remote, when we were in that interesting part of the world in those first couple of months, having lots of conversations daily with my various judges saying, okay, it'll be all right, push the Zoom button, we already set up an account for you, I've emailed you your login, go log in and let's do a Zoom webinar and let's show you how to use this. And changing a lot of minds from our judges and our colleagues about that and said, I will never do that stuff. Who then said, oh my goodness, you mean I don't need to drive to the other county to hold this 15-minute hearing? Yeah, right? So we changed some of the minds and some of the attitudes of those in the justice system. We also changed how we practice and do business. I would argue to say that Zoom, WebEx, Teams, Blue Jeans, whatever sort of connectivity you're using is here to stay. And how you choose to use it is going to be both a local option or in some cases, perhaps a little bit of dicta from the court on high or from your state system if they are in charge of controlling those local rules. But what are some of the things that we've taken away? So I'm going to walk you through for the next couple of minutes. Now that we've had a chance in the last year or so to have some feedback from some of our justice partners as our president. Mr. President, where are you? I can't see with the lights. He's here somewhere, I hope. So as Mr. President in his State of the Profession address referred to all of our justice partners. So you're going to hear from both some of our state systems and some of our justice partners here about some of the things that they've looked back on over the last couple years. So if you're not familiar with ISLES, they're one of our justice partners out there that have done work in our legal space and really, as the Institute for the Advancement of the American Legal System, they focus on what are some of the foundational issues that need to change and grow and evolve in our judicial system in order to address the things that are needed from our litigants and from the folks that come before us. So when they looked back at some of the issues here and got together some web forums and whatnot of some thought leaders in our justice system from around the country and looked back over the last couple of years, they said things like, we've got to be flexible and acknowledge that over the last 3 years, we have been flexible, right? But we have used that flexibility to leverage some of the change. That case management is important. So as backlogs and things like that have increased, we've needed to deal with that and use our core practices of case management of that. Pre-trial processes are huge in alleviating some of the burdens that we have on our case. Trials are all independent. You can't choose one size fits all when it comes to looking at solutions. Cooperation, civility, all those kinds of things are all hallmarks of what we did and how we weathered the storm of the pandemic. And not the least of which is virtual proceedings have now made the justice system more participatory. And we're going to give a couple examples of this in just a moment. But that next one down there in that gray box about the courtroom still matters. So how many of you all had this sort of feeling, this thing, this nudge, this voice in the back of your head? Virtual proceedings are great, but it's not the solution. It's part of the solution, right? That you're having that nagging voice in the back of your head saying, ooh, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable about having a felony jury trial all by Zoom when evidence is going to be presented. Or even a civil case or a domestic matter being tried before a jury or even tried before a judge when there's lots of complex evidence involved, and trying to do that by Zoom. I'm seeing some head nods here, at least those that I'm not blinded by the lights. So obviously technology matters. And some of the things that the industry is going to promote, and we're going to see a lot of those folks tomorrow if you go and visit the vendor showcase, they're going to be talking about what some of the things that the industry is doing to address some of these concerns here, right? So let's look at our friends here in Florida. Can I give a shout out to my friends in Florida? You're here in the building, right? All right. Okay. I threw this one in last night for you. That's how much I'm pivoting up here, folks. So, you had your state court administrator, Allie, up here yesterday. I don't know, Allie, if you're still in the room. I pulled this from one of y'all's recent reports here. This is just a couple of the circuits in the state of Florida and sort of the reflections that they have done over the last couple of years. I love the Fourth Circuit sort of reference to, the journey never imagined. Because, right, we never thought that we were going to embrace a world where we had to address a pandemic and had to change things so frequently. So they understood that they needed to change their pace, move to more virtual environment. Folks in the Fifth Circuit here leveraged their Zoom and also Teams to create greater access and greater justice opportunities for folks, developing strategies in the Sixth Circuit, Seventh Circuit, really trying to look at some of those remote work and how that plays in. Folks in the Eighth really focused on a community of collegiality and really having a lot of communication open with everybody as they move forward. The Ninth, and that is Orlando, for this hometown boy of Orlando. Shout out to you all. I like their reference there to say, having helpers everywhere. This realization that staff across all divisions and units really stepped up to really help one another as they move through the pandemic. So this is just a sampling of a couple of things. Folks in Indiana as well took a sort of look back at what they did, realizing that folks like you all that work in the courts, and importantly, folks that are in the courthouse and the clerk's office are essential workers. How many of you all had a challenge with that in the initial days of the pandemic when everybody was closing? It's like police officers, really important. Firefighters, really important. Paramedics, healthcare workers, doctors, all that kind of stuff. City workers that are fixing, the pipes and public works and stuff, really important. But no one probably really thought of us as essential workers. But we had to pivot on that too, right? Because we had this pesky thing called the Constitution and rule of law and due process. We can't shut down. People can't stay in jail indefinitely. People need bonds. People need bail. People need to be heard. Sometimes people need to get divorced. Other things need to happen, that the judicial system has to be open. So again, making sure that and understanding that we are flexible and we are as essential as anyone else in our own world. Communication and flexibility. Technology was in play. Having a lot of stay calm and sort of Zen moments going through the process. Keeping the public informed through external communication. Really involving stakeholders. Really being adaptable. Making sure the leadership was bought in. And then making the steps necessary to prepare the way to address whatever the next issue that came before us. Arizona, are you in the house? Just one? Come on, it's not just Tina. Thank you, Arizona. So as you all looked back and over the last couple of years, understanding that virtual hearings did perhaps open the door to justice a little bit more, right? increased the number of proceedings, expanded the use of technology, you going to sort of e-jury, sort of check-in and doing some of the questionnaires for jury processes online and electronically to minimize some of the number of bodies coming into the courthouse in that confined space. Really developing those communication strategies and sharing that with their colleagues and their public. And then hopefully developing some long-term health and safety protocols that are now in place as we kind of move forward. So, New York, are you in the house? This is awkward. They're with Emily. Okay. In deference to Emily, as a New Yorker, Emily, I know you're out there and listening. So in deference to your colleagues, both upstate and in the city, we recognize that you probably had some travel demands on travel delays and whatnot. But your colleagues in the New York Unified System did also have sort of a blue ribbon commission that got together and just released their report back in January of this year, listing a numerous things. I'm not going to go all of them that are here on the screen. Suffice it to say, a lot of focus on technology, a big understanding that virtual proceedings have a role in the court system, that it needs to be right-sized to the thing going on, and probably the biggest lesson learned, that our rules and our procedures need to adapt to this new normal that's coming before us. So as you sort of see there at the end in the last gray box down the bottom right of that screen, understanding that they needed to create a more permanent commission to continue this discussion of saying, what do we need to continue to evolve to embrace some of these lessons and some of these changes that have happened here before us? Okay, so my role here today was to give you all the NACM perspective, not the other world perspective. So stay with me. So any of you that know me know that I love NACM and I love the core competencies. I wouldn't be up here and the ability to do what I do every day without the support and the lessons that I've learned from NACM over the years and the role that the core competencies have played in making me a better court manager, and I hope in making you as well. So I want to take a moment to do just a quick dive, not a deep dive, just slightly below the surface here, about why our core competencies matter when we're talking about sustaining change, when we talk about learning from the challenges that have come before us. So we all know, and you're focusing on several of these core competencies here at the conference today. We've got our vision, that's sort of the big thinking, that's the leadership, the strategic planning, and the court governance. That's the rules, that's the forward thinking that we have to do. That's how we take lessons learned and push them into the future of what do we want the future to look like, and what are the skills that we need day in and day out to lead our staff to have and support that vision for what the future looks like. Then we counter that with what's on that front end, that principal concept where we have public trust and confidence. You heard about that if you were here this morning with Jeffrey and the State of the Profession address, hearing from some of the colleagues, really talking about how important that all that we do is tied to public trust and confidence. Because without that, without the public believing in what we do in the court system, we can't sustain change. We can't have the rule of law. We can't issue a summons or a judgment and know that it's going to be followed and obeyed if the public doesn't feel that the courts as an institution are a system that needs to be followed and a system that needs to be revered. It's sort of what makes us unique and really makes us the envy of a lot of folks around the world. And ultimately our purposes and responsibility, knowing that we have things like due process and maintaining the court record, all these things that we have to do. But the bulk of what we do day in and day out is in this practice model, right? We have case flow, workflow, operations, public relations, workforce development, ethics, budget, all those kinds of things. So we know as good court managers that in any given moment, we're fighting fires, right? You may feel that why we're supposed to be in that tiny little blip in the middle there where there's all those overlapping circles. And for you math folks, that's a Venn diagram. You want to be in the middle of it. That's the sweet spot. But we know that most of the time we're hovering around the periphery. We're dealing with an ethics issue. We're dealing with a budget issue. We're dealing with a staffing issue. I was talking with one of my former fellow colleagues about a staffing issue just a little while ago. So those kinds of things can consume us day in and day out. So as we look to sustain change, we look back to the core competencies that we have here with NACM and realize how can we do what we do, and always take that moment to step back and say, how do I connect what I'm doing right now as an operational issue? What's the ethical issue here as well? What is the strategic planning future issue that I need to be concerned about? How can I as a leader lead us to the future or this vision for what we want based on this issue that I'm focusing on now? So those are the kinds of things that we sort of talk about and address as we go forward. So we're going to do now a slightly deeper dive into just 3 of these. We're going to talk about operations management, workforce management, and accountability in court performance. Why? Because our fine folks and the folks that help provide some of the funding for you today to support this conference is our colleagues over at the State Justice Institute. For those that are not aware of them, you saw Jonathan Mattiello, the executive director of SJI, on the video this morning. SJI is a federal entity. They support the work that we do in our state court system by providing grants and funding to support a lot of projects. So as we were all pivoting over the last couple years in the pandemic to do things differently and to keep the doors open and to expand access to justice when a time when people probably needed some of the access to justice the most, they focused and stood up a special grant program to address some of the pandemic issues. And that was part of their pandemic response recovery grant. They did a couple of grants over the last probably year to 2 years to look at some of these initial innovations, and I'm going to talk to you about those for just a moment. So from the workforce development perspective, they funded a project at the Michigan Judicial Institute. Michigan folks here? Yes? Wow. Okay, there's just a couple of you here, and maybe it's after lunch and you're not quite fully awake yet. But I saw Zanelle, she was waving at me at least. So they funded a project with the Michigan Judicial Institute to put forward an e-learning development, knowing that as we transition and learn from the pandemic, that do we need, and I know this is counterintuitive, talking to a room full of people in person, do we need to have all of our training in person like we did pre-pandemic? How many of you all did some type of remote learning in the last 3 years? Okay, for those of you at home, that was pretty much everyone in the room. So follow up to that, how many of you probably did more remote learning in the last 3 years than you typically did in a year prior to the pandemic? Okay, virtually everyone again. So guess what? All the adult learning concepts and the things that we do when we try to teach our colleagues in person doesn't always translate well to the remote world. So the folks at the MJI, with funding from the State Justice Institute, looked and developed a curriculum to be used by their folks in the state, and is also available for download if you all need some strategies at home, on how to develop online programs that focus on adult learning concepts so that they could take that away and provide that. From an operations management perspective, so this is the day in, nuts and bolts of what we do day in and day out, right? Okay, here, this was a project through the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, that they worked with their juvenile, family, and tribal court judges about what were the pandemic responses dealing with juvenile issues, right? So they realized that they surveyed folks from around the country, over 300, represented over 146 different staffs, judicial officers, court administrators from a range of different types of communities, urban, rural, suburban, tribal, and others. And their takeaways were that most courts made significant investments in their new practices, like e-filing, litigant notifications, remote hearings, and that many courts plan to sustain those once the pandemic ended. But that sustainability was going to be a challenge. Again, from an operations perspective, our folks from King County, anybody from King County, Washington here? They're right where? Nope, okay. So our folks in King County, Washington received some funding to do some surveys and analysis of what did both attorneys, court staff, and judges, and sometimes jurors, think about some of the changes that were happening during the pandemic. Here, just an example on the screen there, you'll see that when we talk about prospective jurors, civil attorneys, employees, would they recommend using Zoom for a jury selection process? Wow, employees like it, attorneys not so much, not a surprise, but the jurors really like it. So as we look at some of these things, is that a rethinking? And just for your reference, that's on a scale of 1 to 6, not a scale of 1 to 100. So 6 being pretty high. So that 5.4 there of jurors being very interested in being able to access court services, at least that preliminary piece of that jury selection, being able to do that remotely through questionnaires or online or through Zoom and whatnot, learning some of that. So again, jurors were embracing the use of technology. And this one was one of Emily Lagrada's project here, what she called the Court Voices Project, and getting staff feedback. So she went in and interviewed staff at courts around the country that she had funding for, and really found that from your perspective, that case type matters. Let me make sure you understand. Case type matters. Again, doing a felony jury trial by Zoom might be different than doing a motion hearing on a misdemeanor by Zoom. So the case type matters. Same thing in civil cases and domestic. That most of the staff really supported hearings for what we call the ministerial, the sort of getting the case to the next step, dealing with a discovery issue, dealing with a minor motion issue, dealing with a scheduling issue. What we often sort of colloquially call in a lot of places, those big old calendar calls, or cattle calls, as some of us call it. See, I knew as soon as I said it, I'd see the name. So yeah, the big calls where you have 50, 60 cases on that, and the judge is just rattling through them left, one after another. Those ones tend to benefit both all the parties not having to inconvenience attorneys and staff to do that they could do some of that remotely. But there was some mixed perspectives from staff on things like first appearances. Was that a useful use of virtual technology? It was it depended. So I encourage you all to take a look at this report as well. So our folks in Texas, is Texas in the house? Okay, I knew there'd always be a couple. So welcome to our friends in Texas. They got some funding and worked with our colleagues at the National Center for State Court with some of that SJI funding, and really took a look at some of the initial remote hearings that they did and said, what's going on and what's different? Can you believe it that Zoom hearings took longer than regular in-person hearings? Yes, it did. We now have stats to show that. So we now know what the differential is between an in-person hearing and a Zoom-based hearing for the same kind of thing. Because there are things that can't be necessarily accounted for, right? When you have everybody in person, technology is not a problem, although it can be if people can't be heard and their voice needs to be amplified. But when you're online, you're only as good as the weakest link in that pipeline. So if somebody has a slow internet connection, they have a bad camera, they have a bad microphone, or in many cases, they're calling from their smartphone in their car to appear before court. I don't recommend that, by the way. But those kinds of things happen. So the lack of preparation by the parties, the quick change of pace, but yet higher appearance rates were happening. There were fewer default judgments because people had a greater access to the courts by utilizing technology. So while things might have taken longer, there were some benefits to be seen from that. Lastly here on accountability and court performance, again, another one from Emily and her group, really looking at that court user feedback and saying we need to embrace this world of communicating with you. And more to the point, if you're here, how many of your staff are busy doing the work of justice back in your court? So making sure that as we are embracing and addressing these challenges that come before us, that we're talking to our staff and getting regular and honest and critical feedback about what's working and what's not. Because probably the person who is on the front counter is going to give you a different perspective than the clerk that's sitting in the courtroom, or the person who is pushing the buttons on the Zoom call versus somebody who is working in the judge's chamber. So looking at the court changes and the things that were evolving from a variety of different perspectives. So listening matters. And Emily's got a lot of great information on her website on this, so take a look at that. So what we are going to ask you all to do for a few minutes, because it wouldn't be a NACM conference and it wouldn't be a TJ-led NACM session without putting you all to work just a little bit. On your tables in front of you, we have narrowed it down to these same 3 core competencies: workforce development, operations management, and accountability in court performance. So I want you to put your thinking hat on for just a moment, and for just a few minutes at your table, there are a series of questions that we are asking you about. What have you been doing in this realm, whether it be workforce development, accountability in court performance, or operations management? What have you changed or done differently in the last 3 years? What is that local innovation? What kind of impact has that had? And if you measured it, what resources did you need? And are you able to sustain it? Talk amongst yourselves, and then we're going to get some feedback from you all in just a few minutes. All right, everyone. This is good news. This is good news because y'all are still talking. So if I can bring you all back, bring you back to the present. Y'all been looking at the past. We need to bring it on back. Come on back. All right, this is where I wish I knew how to whistle, but I don't. There you go, thank you. Okay, so here's what's gonna happen next, colleagues. I am having 2 folks join me up on the stage. They are former colleagues and practitioners from out in the field. I'll refer you to their bios in the app for all the pertinent details. But I've got Lori Givens, who is now the Vice President for Court Consulting at the National Center, former state court administrator from Kentucky for the last 15 years or so, and Shay Cleary, who spent the last year and a half in the private sector with a technology vendor, and prior to that, almost 20 years, I believe, in the IT in the Minnesota judicial branch. So they are going to help me sort of debrief what we've got going on here from you. So I'm gonna have 2 folks in the room, Rick Pierce over there, my friend in the yellow tie, and Mark Dalton, Mike Weinberg, sorry, over here, my friend from Daytona in Florida, over on the other side of the room. So what we wanna hear from you all for a few minutes, if you had a wonderful, scintillating, exciting conversation at your table, which it looked like many of you were, we want to hear from a table or two or three what that innovation was that you all talked about. Did you come up with a solution for it? And most importantly, not only what it was, but do you all have a plan or questions about your plan on how to sustain that particular innovation? So we'll take some volunteers and sort of get some feedback. So if you are at your table and want to share what you have learned from your colleagues, go ahead and toss that hand up and wave it around like you just don't care. All right. Don't make me come out and find some of you all at tables, because I got my soft walking shoes on. So, do we have someone over here, Mark? Okay, we're making Mark hustle. And let us know where you are and who you are.
My name is Luke. That's loud. I'm Luke Emerson, and I'm with the Superior Court of Maricopa County. I'm with several of my colleagues here who all represent the same court. And what we talked about is the Embark Plan, which is a process in which we purposefully start training our staff, or especially new staff members, on how to be a leader within the courts and the things to look for and proper procedures and what our expectations are of leaders. And they've incorporated DEI, workforce development, into this program, and we've made it a mandatory, soft mandatory. I think it's a voluntold thing, but I think the Embark program is a great way to address real world problems in our current state of the judiciary, and that's what we talked about.
Great. So one of our follow-up questions to you, since you have your table of experts there, so that was something that did not exist during the pandemic and came into being during the pandemic?
That's correct.
Okay, and that was a way to embrace some sort of continued learning for your folks during the pandemic. So how is that being sustained as we go into the future?
Oh, that's a great question.
And don't say funding. Don't say funding. Something other than funding.
So we are making an effort to make sure that all of our administrators, supervisors, anyone in a leadership position buys into this program, because that is the way that we are going to ensure that future leaders continue to come up through the program. So that it's basically about buy-in and support from your workforce and perpetuating that through future generations.
Great. So cultivating those future leaders by investing in them so that they're there. We got some other folks. Go ahead. All right, another table. You're making this awkward. Well, I see a hand, no? Oh, okay. Over by Howard, no, we got Roger back there in the back first, and then we'll come up here to the front, Mark.
Okay, so our table talked about accountability of all judicial districts in the state. And there are some courts in the states that are the mega courts, and they produce their own training programs, and they do a good job of working with the AOC to get appropriate training to their supervisors and their staff. And there's other districts who are smaller who struggle to have those resources. So one of the thoughts, of course, here at NACM is to have the state court administrators make sure that all of their trial court administrators in the state are enrolled as NACM members so that they can come to these conferences and get these educational materials and learn how they can be more accountable to come up with their own training and have that confidence built. So that's one of the ideas. The other idea here is in Oregon, they have a Office of Education, Equity, and Inclusion, and also a Talent Development Office, and they work together to provide resources to the local trial courts. So if the trial courts request a training, they can get it put in line, and then they have trainers go out to those trial courts to provide the training, which is very helpful.
So great point. So your big courts, your big jurisdictions can do a lot of things in-house along training and whatnot. But for some of those smaller jurisdictions, they might be able to reach out to their state entity that can provide some of that support to the smaller communities. Great. I think, Mark, we had up here next to Howard. I think someone was voluntold up there.
Howard is my new friend. He's voluntold me. So we're from different areas, Atlanta, right, and Tennessee and Austin. And what we started focusing on, not our innovation, but it was forced on us all, that we now have staff in clerical positions that have an expectation of teleworking. And that was something that most of those folks in that position never really had the opportunity for. And so we're evaluating how we can look at that while still providing excellent service, but tie it into key performance indicators so we're not losing the productivity, and identifying certain tasks and roles that really it's appropriate for, and make sure it is viewed as a benefit for people who are performing at a level that best serves our communities.
Great. Well, I think that remote and hybrid work schedule is a thing that probably none of us have a perfect solution to yet, but we're dealing with it. I think, Lori, do you want to chime in on this one from your perspective from Kentucky?
What I'm hearing so far, really, TJ, is everybody identifying something that's been called one of the key vulnerabilities for courts of the future. And the National Center launched the Just Horizons Initiative, the plan. It started in 2019, and then the pandemic hit. But when we started planning initially, we were planning for what courts were going to look like in 2030. How do we get courts ready for 10 years from now? And then the pandemic hit, and it was, how do we get courts ready right now? And one of the stories that I shared with TJ and Shay just a minute ago, and I'm not sure about you guys, but when you were going through the pandemic, I think we probably did anywhere between 10 to 15 different administrative orders to manage our rules that were ever changing, to be responsive to how we were staying open, how we were handling our emergency procedures, how we were literally meeting people at the door or in the parking lot, to, especially our self-represented litigants. And we were having to change our rules constantly. And one of the key vulnerabilities is an operations plan for the future. And I know many of us, we had an emergency management plan, but it wasn't at all ready for what happened to us. So in December 2022, I have to think, it's actually 2021, climate change is one of the key vulnerabilities that this report discussed, and it's really hard in Kentucky, as you can imagine, to have a conversation with our legislators about how you prepare the courts to be ready for climate change, because we're an economy that has typically burned coal. So those aren't words they really like to hear us use. So we had to figure out how to re-message our needs as the judiciary. We had a tornado in December, clearly a result of what we knew was a change in our climate structure, in the middle part of the states, and we had to pivot immediately, to use TJ's word, and have that court. Not only did we have our courthouse completely destroyed in Mayfield, Graves County, Kentucky, we had all the law offices in the community destroyed. And this was a very rural community that didn't use a lot of electronic technology. They were very much committed to the vestiges of a paper court system intentionally. And suddenly everything was gone. Everything was gone for the court system, and everything was gone for every attorney in the town. And what we immediately had to do was get courts stood up, just like we had to remain open during the pandemic. But instead of creating an order of operations for the Graves County facility, we had our orders already in place for the pandemic. All we had to do was change a few words. So when you think about building out a continuity of operations plan, you have to build in the pieces about remote work, what the rules are around remote work. How do you support your staff who've been working remotely, who also, we still need to be the face of the community because we still have so many people who come in for help to the system. How do we staff and support that remotely? But it's just amazing because, and I'm continuing to kind of drone on, TJ, and bounce around a little, but these were the 6 vulnerabilities that the Just Horizons Initiative identified. And what I kind of want to encourage everybody to do, go back and look at your existing strategic plan and think about whether you're addressing these initiatives and these vulnerabilities. But the first one was a forward-looking anticipatory capacity in court governance. A second was focusing on user-centered experience and inclusive design. The third was embracing a data-driven mindset. The fourth was understanding and managing the role of private entities in court work. The fifth was preparing your COOP plan, the backbone of which we almost all have in place now because of the pandemic. And the sixth was, and this is what reminded me, cultivating a future-fit workforce and workplace. As we know that we're marketing these jobs to a young generation that turns over positions 2 to 3 years, how do we build in that experience? How do we build in leadership? How do we build a workforce that wants to stay with the court system? Because it's got to be a lot more than just about money, I think,
Well,
and salary.
Laura, I think you make a great point there in reference
was-
to sort of the remote working of, we had COOP plans before, and they were all predicated on some type of sort of natural disaster, right? And it was, oh, the courthouse is not accessible. And it's like, oh, we have the emergency kit, which has got the clipboards and some forms and things like that. How do we stand up doing basic operations for a couple hours, a few days? But when we're talking a complete change in how we operate for weeks on end, having remote work and how do we then manage staff in that, that is a challenge. Shay, did you want to jump in on this?
Sure. Everything I talk about is primarily, I'm a technologist, so it's on the technology side. And I was going to talk about COOP planning as well, because the pandemic was one type of disaster, but of course, we could have weather-related disasters. And one that most concerns me and that we need to make sure we're preparing for are cybersecurity events. More than ever, we have more things online. We're doing more things digitally. Thanks to AI and some things are moving faster. And we need to make sure that we're accountable in developing robust cybersecurity response plans and educating everyone from the chief judge and all staff. The other other thing I'd like to share is that one thing we saw during the pandemic across the country is IT staff really doing a lot more in courtrooms to make them hybrid than they ever have before. Doing crestron programming, doing buy-amp programming, doing things to make sure things work. That's something that I hope is somewhat sustainable as well, and it's especially beneficial to rural courts where they don't have AV vendors to drive out there and fix a courtroom. And some of those innovations we've also seen with vendors providing just things that run over your network. So those are some things that I hope stay as well.
Let's hear from a couple more tables out here amongst us. Rick, did you see anybody over there? Or Mark? Go ahead and tell us what we got in the back corner there, Rick. Hustle, Rick. I know he's got the hustle in him. He's a football coach on the side for high school, so we know Rick's got the hustle.
Another Rick, actually, Rick Miller from Tallahassee here in Florida. In terms of streamlining operations as well and remote work, we found in our circuit, we're up in the second judicial circuit, that you still have some dockets that are running remotely as well. So we're always trying to find the right way to balance for parties between in-person proceedings and then also remote proceedings. So it's another consideration.
Great. So I think to the point we were talking about earlier and looking at some of those state sort of recommendations about case management still reigns supreme. You've got to sort of review your cases about which sort of pathway they need to go into, and the case type matters too for whether it's virtual or not, okay? Other tables that want to share one of their innovations and how you have looked to sustain that or the challenge you're having to sustain that. Remember, I can't see completely out here with the blinding lights, so raise a hand. We see one over here?
Right up front.
Oh, Howard, go ahead. Mark's coming.
That's okay. I just wanted to add something. Y'all hit on a lot of the points that that we experience and has created a new environment for us. We actually have increased our leadership team by 3 because we were on a hybrid system. We never shut down, and so there had to be others that we had to depend upon to be in the building, and we were getting hit by COVID like crazy in the courtrooms. But now my leadership team is gone from 7 to 3, so that's also given employees within the office a chance to become leaders and become managers. And another thing that happened—
I have to ask one question, Howard, because I think everyone's probably wondering. Mm-hmm. The 7 to 3, I hope, was for a good reason, that people chose to retire?
No, we went up by 3.
Oh, you went up by 3.
We went from
okay.
7 to 10.
7 to 10.
7
gotcha.
to 10.
Okay.
And no. And so these were—
I was confused, folks.
These were good employees that had not been elevated to a supervisory role.
Excellent.
But we were kind of forced to do it to make the hybrid plan work. We're still hybrid. Now every one of my employees have laptops that they can take home. And my customer service area, I'm the criminal court clerk in Nashville, and customer service basically works from home now. And so we have developed, like you were talking about, we had a living and breathing plan through COVID. So now we have a robust disaster plan that has been created. We just finished our work from home policies with the city's HR and our HR for our employees. And we're still trying to figure it all out as to how hybrid we're going to stay and how hybrid we're going to be. But one big thing is that in the state of Tennessee, criminal courts, clerk's offices did not have standards written by the Supreme Court for e-filing. But when COVID hit, we got the permission from, everybody got permission from the Supreme Court for electronic filings and what have you, and our standards were approved, and so it caused us to be able to have e-filing in our office now, and so that's, it was a bad and is a bad situation. We still have people out with COVID, but the fact is that it has changed our environment, and it'll never go back to the way it was.
So I bet for many of you all in that e-filing perspective, you've seen e-filing numbers spike over the last couple of years, and some of those more voluntary e-filing categories are now probably e-filing more.
And as my former Chief Justice used to say, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. It was suddenly the time where a lot of our voluntary case types for e-filing became mandatory. It really created a lot of opportunities for us to make some hard decisions that we hadn't previously been willing to make. And another thing, we were very fortunate in Kentucky that we were able to convince our legislature to appropriate a lot of ARPA funds to us for some technology investments. I think one thing that we all probably share right now, with the exception probably of a few states, and I know especially our rural jurisdictions struggle, we're looking at state surpluses that are kind of unprecedented right now for the most part in most states. And I know at the local level that isn't maybe all trickling down. I'm not sure that that is the same for you in your local courts, but talk to your state court administrator's office about this, because there is a lot of one-time money there for a number of us. How do we do this planning? Expenditures that may have long-term maintenance costs, but might be a one-time opportunity for you to make a case for an investment because we have the funds. Because one of the next crises I'm afraid that we need to prepare for, and I hope I'm just not being negative, but having been here in 2008, when we had the Great Recession, when we had to have layoffs and cut a bunch of programs, we didn't have the opportunity to maybe plan for that. I feel like we have a little bit of a unique opportunity to look ahead and just think, what if? What if we face some pretty dramatic budget reductions in the next 2 to 3 years? What could we do now to plan for that? Because I know we're stockpiling rainy day funds in Kentucky. Those will all go to the executive branch. If we don't find a way to make the case for them to remember the judicial branch now, because when we get to the point of the emergency, it'll be too late. So have those conversations now about the language you need on emergency planning, the language you need for technology investments, the language you need to pay your employees now because you're preparing for the future. I don't know. I think about that. We had the crisis of the pandemic. We have this incredible influx of funding, which has created a surplus, and we could potentially be looking at a recession in 2 to 3 years. How do we plan for that? So just not to be negative, right? But just to be realistic.
So we're going to transition here in our last couple minutes in this session, and I'm going to ask both Shay and Lori a couple of thoughts. So anything else from what we've heard from folks out here on innovations that you all wanted to chime in on, just sort of generally? The remote issue, technology or adoption of technology in the last couple of years?
No, just that courts can be incredibly creative when we need to be, and of course it comes from our desire to serve. Some innovations that we've heard that may stay there are some courts that essentially opened a drive-through where they would have a window that they would open to their courthouse to be able to serve people socially distanced. There's one court I know of in Washington that is now looking at fully implementing a drive-through because they have some safety concerns with their staff, and they don't have a lot of security and support. So they're looking at that. We've also, there's also been other local innovations on how to reach people. I don't know if you guys know, in Utah, there's a judge who does kayak court, where he will kayak. Thank
They're
you.
here, they're in the
Yes.
house.
Which is incredible, because he's reaching people where they are, and he'll go out and serve and help them take care of things. And I think as part of the pandemic, we've become a little bit more customer focused.
So as a follow-up, I think, to Lori's question a moment ago, she talked about sort of federal funding, and many of your cities and counties got sort of that initial COVID or CARES money in the early times, and then that transitioned into the ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act Fund,
yes.
that now still is out there and still has another 2 years of time to be used. What other sort of funding sources and things might have you seen?
And a lot of the states have used that as replacement funding for other projects with created surpluses. So it could be a general fund appropriation, frankly.
Because they've used the ARPA
because
for something
they've used the ARPA funds. I do want to say, and I want to shout out, since we're talking about funding, I don't know if Jonathan Mattiello is here, but the State Justice Institute has provided funding for strategic planning consistent with this Just Horizons project that we talked about, because I can tell you that the strategic plan I left behind is not at all a court ready or court of the future strategic plan. We really need to start over, frankly, but I just wanted to mention that there is some funding available through SJI for this initiative also.
Right. So keep in mind sji.gov. Shay?
While we're talking about funding, on the cybersecurity side, there's also a lot of funding available, and essentially free or very low-cost tools for courts and other government entities to have access to, with the Center for Internet Security and MSISAC. And your technologists and leaders are likely aware of these, but they're things that are to look at and do now, not wait until there's an incident.
So what's, I know, Lori, you talked about Just Horizons, and I'll ask you a specific question on that in a moment, but from y'all's perspective, and certainly if there's others out there that want to chime in as well, what are our next challenges? We've had this big public health emergency. What do we see is the next big challenge, Jay?
Oh, geez.
I feel like this is like
AI.
NPR, wait, don't tell me, and they ask at the end, what's the next big thing? So what's the...
Yeah. So this is, I actually thought about this question on my run this morning with the running group, or with the fun run. And I think well, first of all, how we weathered the pandemic, I think, was rather incredible. We bent a little bit, but we didn't break. And the reason we were able to do that is because, of the rule of the law. We have core tools to understand statistically how we're doing, what our backlog is. And most importantly, we have incredibly dedicated staff. And we were able to weather that pandemic because of that. The next crisis that I think is going to be coming is more around data, AI, and the potential for misinformation, for people to kind of skew what is the truth. And big data is a big part of it, and we need to make sure that we are the ones who are kind of writing the narrative. We're the ones who have defined our data well. We have public records online. We are the source of truth, and we need to basically make sure our data is where it needs to be. And then also keeping up with AI, and that's also related to data governance and everything as well. But I think we did great with the other pandemic. There's no reason we can't rise to the challenge for the next challenge.
Shay, you shared a couple of great examples in the Joint Technology Committee meeting on Sunday, and sort of to crystallize two examples, I think, for the group, I would love for you to talk about a little bit. Exhibits, evidence introduced in court. And so think about your run-of-the-mill traffic case, and a person's charged with running a stop sign. The law enforcement officer who gave them a traffic ticket wasn't there, or maybe charged them for speeding, doing a 55 in a 45 zone. But they go to court and they show the judge a picture. Look, this is the intersection where the officer accused me of running a stop sign. You don't see a stop sign here. And that's an AI-generated photograph that the stop sign's been removed from. And we as the court are going to accept evidence that comes in unless somebody is there to contradict or make the counter-argument on what the evidence is actually showing. And then you think about the story about, I think of the video. An exchange can be completely manufactured between two parties in a case that isn't actually a real video. And I think about the example that Chief Justice Hecht was just talking about at the American Law Institute. This is a real challenge for our bar associations, who are going to have to develop rules on professional conduct around what's generated. I think, I don't know if everybody, I don't know where our folks from New York are. They're right on a plane stuck somewhere, aren't they?
They're not here.
We had the two New York lawyers disciplined for using ChatGPT to write their briefs, cited to cases that were non-existent. These are what I think, right, are our challenges, really our big ones.
So to you staff attorneys in the room, we love you. Check the references on the filings.
Don't just assume that the picture introduced into evidence now is real.
Right, when it can be manufactured.
Yeah, it's really...
So, Laura, I wanted to follow up on what you mentioned earlier with Just Horizon. So you and I had the privilege of being part of that when it started in 2019. It was supposed to be this big forward-looking think piece about how do we make ourselves future fit or future ready 30 years from now. We had just started, with a quick chat in early 2020, and then the world kind of went sideways, and we had a timeline to deliver that. And so what was supposed to be a bunch of in-person gatherings were all a series of remote conversations, and we eventually got together. What's your takeaway in light of lessons learned from the pandemic on how that sort of future thinking kind of comes into play?
So, TJ, I want you to know, was embracing it from the beginning, and he's incredibly creative and the brilliant person that you've seen before you here. I was the person before the pandemic. This is ridiculous. Most of these scenarios are never going to happen. We're spending so much time on the hypothetical that we're never going to see. And then literally 3 months later, we saw all of it. And it wasn't 10 years, it was now. And we in Kentucky could not have been more unprepared. And I thought, what if this exercise had happened for us 5 years before the pandemic? How much more prepared we would have been had we had this. So I just want you to encourage everybody to look at the report, because it will cause you to think about things that you haven't even thought of yet. And it's ahead of us. We don't know necessarily what the next one is, but it's ahead of us.
And some of those scenarios in the future really talked about the role of data in the courts. And Shay, I wanted to open that up to you, about sort of what is the future of data and learning from the pandemic here about having access to data and making improvements to our data systems.
Data-driven decision-making, I think, is one of the items in future of the courts. And it's really leveraging that and getting a handle on your data, because as the world, I guess, adopts AI and everyone knows it's moving incredibly quickly, we're going to need to adopt some of the same tools, and our data needs to be in a state where we can do that and we know it's accurate. We may even want at some point be contributing to these large language data models accurate information for them to use to make accurate conclusions. It'll be a brave new world, and we need to be prepared for it.
So I know at your tables, we'd given the opportunity on that last question to ask yourselves with your colleagues there, if you had that magic wand and anything could happen, what would you wave and what magic words would you say to make something better or different for how we operate in the courts? So I'm sure you all had some wonderful chats on that, but I wanted to open it up in our last couple of minutes here, both to Shay and Lori, to say, if you had that magic wand, what would you do?
Oh,
what
Shay,
would you wish for?
Please go first.
I think it's to, and I hope I don't take yours, to remember what we learned through the pandemic, that we've done it before, we can do it again. And actually, I think this morning, Jeff in his NACM address nailed it, the things that we need to continue doing. We need to continue to partner and have valuable partners, whether, the National Center, NACM, of course, and SJI, and because we'll succeed together and we'll learn from one another. We also need to continue to be customer focused. I think we're best when we're understanding how we can best serve our customers and meet their needs. And the last part, which was also part of Jeff's this morning, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are better when we're representative of those who serve, and we need to continue to do that. And I think if we do those things while remembering what we learned from the pandemic, make prudent decisions around COOP planning and cybersecurity planning, of course, that'll put us in a position to where we need to be.
I think for me, if we had a magic wand, it would be court leaders, judges, court administrators, your presiding staff who value team, leadership through team building, because it requires that level of collaboration across all the disciplines in the court system to be successful. And, it's hard where I remember when I first started, they were all guessing my DISC score, right? What was I? And I mean, I don't know what I am. I'm a little bit of everything. But I think the one thing that is critical when we're hiring new staff into these roles is that you have people who value team and want to teach and mentor. And I don't know how to underscore that enough in terms of its value to all of the other pieces. It's hard as we recruit talent, and how do we keep young talent with us? They have to feel like they're part of a team. So
I'm going to take my moment, since I'm on the stage, to answer the question myself as well. I'm going to say, from the perspective of, I would like to envision a world here that public trust and confidence in our courts is the highest it can ever be, and it sustains that indefinitely. Because I think with that comes the respect of the other branches of government, that need and that desire to want to collaborate with us, to want to support us, to want to fund us, but then also that public trust and confidence in us that there is the rule of law, that what we do matters, that why we exist and the work that we do in the courts is important and matters. So on that, a couple of takeaways here as we look back to what some of the research that's already been done, looking at those lessons learned, the states that have kind of gotten together, those commissions, the Just Horizons project that we worked on, the work that the National Center is doing, and all the others, really have sort of zoomed in on a couple of things. And this is my shout out to Emily in New York, and the report that you wrote with the funding from SJI, and looking back at some of the earlier projects, how important it is that at the end of the day, collaboration matters. You must have the voice of the users, including your entire court staff, as well as the member of the public and the litigants and your stakeholders, all need to be able to give feedback into how the operation of the courts work. That we must embrace technology and utilize technology to increase access to justice, not separate folks from access to the courts. And all the while, we must do this with balancing the goals that we have at the court with what our vision is and what the inherent purposes and responsibilities of the courts. So with that, we thank you all, and you can have your afternoon.
Great job, TJ.